Gurney Norman served as Kentucky Poet Laureate from 2009 through 2010. He grew up in Perry and Letcher counties in eastern Kentucky in the 1940s and 1950s. From 1955 to 1959, he attended the University of Kentucky, where he majored in journalism and English and wrote his first short stories, which were published in UK's literary journal, Stylus. In 1960, he received a Wallace Stegner Creative Writing Fellowship to Stanford University in California. His teacher at Stanford was the noted Irish short story writer Frank O'Connor. Gurney lived in Menlo Park from the late 1960s through the 1970s. His novel, Divine Right's Trip, and Kinfolks, his collection of short stories, were published during that time. Gurney returned to the University of Kentucky in 1980 as an English professor, and for 15 years served as the director of UK's creative writing program. He is now in his 36th year as a member of UK's English department. 3 of Gurney's short stories have been developed as dramatic films by Appleshop in Whitesburg, Kentucky. He also served as scriptwriter and on-screen presenter for 3 hour-long documentary programs for Kentucky Educational Television. His novella, Ancient Creek, was published in 2012 by Old Cove Press. The theme of Ancient Creek is the healing power of the Appalachian legend of the dogwood blossom. Please join me now in welcoming Gurney Norman.
Thank you, Lori. You know, Kentuckians can be very proud of their state. Their state government sponsors and makes it possible the Kentucky Arts Council. And the Kentucky Arts Council is a wonderful entity in our public institutions. And Laurie is the director and has been for a long time. But we just want to take this moment just to appreciate the Kentucky Arts Council. For a long time, I've worked on a book of fiction. It's actually a collection of short pieces, most of them fictional. I call it Crazy Quilt. And I think of each shorter piece in the book as a piece of a quilt. So I'll read from that. This is a little story called The Photograph. My mother and her people and my father and his people had stayed up all night at Grandma and Granddad Collier's house in 1944, arguing over where I was going to live while my father was gone to war. My mother, whom I hadn't seen in a year, and her sisters, Arnetta and Ruth, and some boyfriend of Ruth's, had tried to take me away to Indianapolis for the duration. But my father, who was home on furlough, and Grandma and Granddad and Aunt Evelyn and her husband, L.C., had shouted them down until finally, about 4 o'clock in the morning, my mother and her sisters and the man with them all left shrieking and crying. I was only 5 and in bed, but wide awake, of course, listening through the walls to all that was said. I felt guilty because I knew I wanted to stay at Grandma's instead of going with my mother. I loved my mother, but she was strange, and Grandma's house had been my home as long as I could remember, and I didn't want to go away with anyone. Even though I wanted to stay at Grandma's, she said things about my mother that I dreaded to hear her say. I thought at first that the man with them was my mother's boyfriend instead of Aunt Ruth's. Grandma had been telling me that my mother ran around with nasty men, and that was why I didn't see her very often. But I knew that wasn't true. She said that my mother wasn't fit to be my mother anymore. I knew that wasn't true either. I was only 5, but I knew how to hear that kind of grown-up talk without feeling anything about it one way or another. Through the walls, I heard my mother crying and pleading, and Aunt Ruth cussing, and then Grandma and my father shouting. Then I heard some dishes smash on the floor and several doors slam, including the doors of the car my mother and the people with her had come in. The next day, we took my father to the bus station in town so he could get back to his Army unit, which was headed overseas. He hugged me goodbye in front of the bus station, and Aunt Jenny took me by the hand and led me through the throngs of people down Main Street to the Kentucky Theater, and came inside to sit with me for a few minutes, according to our custom. I felt strange from staying awake all night the night before, but I was excited, as always, to be going to the show. I was only 5, but I was well able to sit in the movies by myself. Ever since my mom had moved to Indianapolis and my dad had been in the Army, Jenny had been taking me to the movies on Saturdays. She would come inside and sit with me until I was settled. Then she would pat me on the hand and steal out of the theater to shop in the stores while I watched the show. I hardly noticed when she patted my hand this time, for I was quickly lost in the newsreel images of the war on the movie screen. Falling bombs and burning buildings and battleships firing their huge guns as the Marines landed on the beachheads. When someone patted my arm again and whispered my name, I thought it was Jenny come back to tell me something. It was too dark to see him at first, but then I felt his presence, felt the mystery of my father kneeling beside me like a shadow in the aisle, his actual hand upon my actual arm. Then in the light from the screen, I saw my father's sad face looking at me. "Wilgus," he whispered, "come outside a minute, I'll bring you right back." We had already said goodbye, yet there he was again. How could that be? Wordlessly, I walked with my father up the aisle to the lobby and then to the street outside, where the afternoon light was so bright I had to close my eyes. I tried to follow him through the crowd, but I kept stumbling until he lifted me to his shoulders and carried me high above the throng. All the way up Main Street, past clothing stores and hardware stores and jewelry stores and drugstores, past the courthouse where 2 old men on the top step preached simultaneously to the crush of people below. My father carried me. Then suddenly he set me on the ground and by the hand led me through a door into a photo store, where a little man I'd never seen before quickly sat me on a stool behind a curtain. With his small hands, he pointed my face straight ahead. Then he stepped back and opened the curtain, and then a light flashed before my eyes, so bright I was blinded again. Then my father led me outside and again swung me onto his shoulders, and off we went down the street again, passing rows of buses whose motors were running as soldiers lined up at their doors. Past the post office and the courthouse and the stores. Through the crowd, we ran the length of Main Street back to the Kentucky Theater, where my father stood me on my feet again and led me by the hand down the dark aisle to the same seat I had occupied before. "You be a good boy," he whispered. He pressed his cheek to the top of my head and touched my face with his hand. Then he was gone. I sat there blind a long time, but gradually my eyes adjusted and several years went by. When my father died in the Veterans Hospital in 1951, and the hospital sent his belongings home in a box, I found the picture the little man took of me that day and pictures of my mother as well. Thank you.